So thank you. In this presentation, so I have looked at urbanization patterns in India, which is somewhat similar to what is happening in other low-income countries, especially in Asia. And then I have tried to understand with 2-3 detailed case studies, specific cities, what is happening. So first few slides, I mean, these couple of slides are, in one of the interesting things about or something different that is happening probably in 21st century urbanization, it is happening in low-income countries in Asia and will happen very soon, already has started happening in African countries now. One of the key things in these cities we observe is the presence of informal sector. Now there are all kinds of definitions for informal sector, but I've quoted a couple of definitions from UN Habitat report. One of the things, we can say informal is because it has not been part of our formal plans. Also, it tends to be mostly low-income people living there, engaged in informal employment. The living conditions are not very good and they have poor access to basic amenities. In terms of, urbanization patterns, accessibility to employment has been recognized as a very important right for for most people. And we find now this is, so instead of mobility, I think we start focusing on accessibility in terms of social inclusion. And what is happening, what people do on their own and what otherwise. So I start with, because my whole paper and this study is focusing on what is happening in India. So in India, right after independence, which is 1947, and when actually only less than 20% people were living in urban areas. But at that time itself, as the city started growing, and there was a recognition that this slums, there is another name which is used for informal sector in many cities is also slums. So there is presence of slums, and slums keep growing in these cities. So we need to do something about it. So first, at the central government, in 1956, an act was passed, which was Slum Area Improvement and Clearance Act. And they talked about that, we have to take care of these people who are living in very poor conditions. And we cannot allow cities to continue to have these slums. So, but today when we see, this is according to our 2011 census, what is the percentage of people living in different states, in slums in different states. So state is of course a much bigger boundary here. But however, what is very interesting is that, let me see if I can get the pointer here. It's not that easy.
No, but
it's going somewhere else. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so we see, some of these really big states, Maharashtra, so Mumbai is in Maharashtra, and there you see a lot of, about 20 to 25% people living in slums. This is also one of the richer states compared to others. But we also, Andhra Pradesh is also not a poor state. This is also one of the richer states. Hyderabad is here. So these are two fairly rich states where we see substantial population living in slums. But at the same time, we have these couple of, this is a new formed state, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. These are not so rich states in terms of state GDP, but here also we have very high percentage of people living in slums. When we again, from a census, we look at, this is our distribution of cities, a number of people living in different city sizes. And of course, in our large and mega cities, only much smaller population is living. But a majority of our urbanization is in very small cities. But when we start looking at, again, now we look at what is happening in terms of slum population in cities. So one trend that we observe is that the larger the city, the percentage of slum population is larger. So it is not that poorer people, maybe there are other poorer people living in other cities, but large cities tend to have much larger slum population, and that's what you find in Mumbai, Kolkata. Delhi is kind of an exception, and this Delhi case study will show that why over last few years we have managed to reduce slum population, which turns, here it is shown as 14.6%, but then it is also a question of how people have understood this data and what are the various definitions used, because according to some definition, actually in Delhi also about 70% people are living in slums, if we include all these different definitions. So this is just a quick similarity, no matter where slums are. This is, I'm showing you pictures from Indian cities, but very much similar to what you may find in Latin American cities. This is informal settlement in Chennai, informal settlement in Mumbai, informal settlement in Delhi. So in terms, you can see there are some pictorially also, you can see some similarities, very high density patterns, poor quality housing. Not so high density is not because of high rise, but it's just extremely packed, about 20,000-30,000 people living in very per square kilometer, that kind of density. I think the other interesting thing, especially now this is related to Indian slum population, we start observing location of slums. Where are slums coming up inside the city boundaries? So in this map, the dots, the little black dots which are here on this map, these are the slum population. So this is very much, as you can see, inside the main city boundary, and it is very much dispersed in the whole city area. It is not that in just central city it is concentrated, it is very much dispersed in this whole, within the city boundary. And this is in some of my publications I have called self-organized low-income settlements. They are self-organized because this is not according to any plan. People occupy lands, and this land could be government land or even private land which has not been put to any use. Small patch of land which is along the railway tracks or along the highway roads. This land gets occupied, and this is similar whether it's we talk about Delhi, Mumbai or Chennai or Bangalore, any city in India. And these lands get occupied by people, migrants moving to cities in search of employment, and they put up their shacks and start living there. And because it is not according to any formal master plan of the city, so city governments find it difficult, or in fact not possible, to provide access to clean water and other amenities, because once you provide it, that means you are recognizing it is legal. Over the years, what has happened, that of course, because during our election times, politicians promise these are vote banks, so these people do have voting rights. And in that process, every 5 years when the elections come, many of these slums get what is called notified slums. Once they get notified, then it is possible for city authorities to provide them access to clean water and other basic amenities. And this is slum locations in Mumbai. Again, all these colored patches that we see, the reason they are in different colors, it is showing whether it is along railway track or along industry or along close to residential area, etc. So it's very similar what is happening in Delhi and what is happening in very dispersed all along. And again, from now these days, from Google Maps, one can actually get really good understanding of, just by looking at the Google Maps, you can actually define boundaries. And here I find fascinating, this is from South Delhi. So you can easily make out the pocket which is low income informal settlement versus the density is high in the planned area also, but you can see more regular street patterns and much less density. So the pattern that starts emerging, it is very much always close to a planned formal area. The small pockets of informal settlements are close to formally planned areas. it's residential area or commercial area. And and when we start now analyzing their patterns, activity patterns and trip patterns, there seem to be a very strong symbiotic relationship between these two types of things. Another picture from, again from Delhi, you can see one planned and the other what I call self-planned. So over the years now what has happened is that starting from, actually it started from late 60s in Chennai first and then in Bangalore. By mid 70s it had started happening in Delhi also. This whole very much major emphasis on clean the city. We cannot have slums in the city. So again and again, the slum, so one thing it was recognized was we must give them proper place where they can have housing. Housing is not available, that kind of inexpensive land is not available inside the city boundaries, so shift them out. The picture that is in front of you, the red dots are what is the self-planned locations, and the green dots are which have been planned by the urban planners, that this is where poor people, they have been actually given either starting from first it was 25 square meters of land for each household, and then it became 18 square meters, and then in the last one 12 square meters. That too was not free, they still had to pay a small amount for it, but they did get the legal land title to it, so ownership was there. So and actually there's been a few authors have done very interesting papers on showing that in 70s how they were pushed out, what was the boundary, and then in 80s you see further away, and 90s further away. So they keep getting pushed out further away from the previous locations. So I've just put together a couple of slides on just understanding what has been the policy evolution around this. So in 50s, as I said in the beginning, there was at the central government level, it was recognized that we must take care of slums. At that time, the whole emphasis of the policy was providing decent housing for low-income groups. And a lot of efforts were done, how do we ensure decent housing for low-income groups. Then in 70s, they started talking about there is a need, slums keep coming up, government is not able to provide enough housing for low-income groups. So there is a rehabilitation and resettlement of slums which have come up in the cities. And in the rehabilitation part and in the resettlement, there is no discussion or very little discussion on if you evict slums, you take them away, what happens to them? Are we giving them alternate accommodation? Is somebody tracking, monitoring what is happening to their livelihoods? That is not mentioned at all. Then in 80s, again, this problem is not solved, and we keep having this experience, you shift them and very soon they come back and new slums get formed. And then of course, because of our I would say strength of democracy, that they keep getting notified and they keep getting absorbed in the system. But we can't get rid of slums. Then in 80s, the government decides, and there is a lot of policy around community development programs, and non-governmental organizations get involved. How to take care of this whole problem. And one of the issues they start discussing is that we have to make affordable housing. The finances are not available for this. And financing housing is a big problem because most people who are living here don't have formal jobs. So banks would find it very difficult to finance them. This is completely, the informal settlement also means informal jobs, irregular jobs. So special housing banks, etc. formed. And there are a lot of very interesting experiments around that also in Mumbai, that some of the self-help groups start financing of these kind of housing. Then by 80s, late 80s, the role of state, instead of providing housing for low-income groups, starts changing to enabling. So create regulations and environment in such a way that private sector finds it attractive to invest in this sector. And by 2000 onwards, there is very, very distinct and strong emphasis on involvement of private sector. So what happens now, if we start seeing, at least, so all these policies can be kind of put in four broad type of policies. Land and housing policy, clearance and eviction related policies, then we have upgradation and redevelopment related policies, and then more recent initiatives. So because if we just summarize what happens because of land and housing related policies, right in the beginning we have a Rent Control Act, an Urban Land Ceiling Act, which means rents in the central area is not left to the, it's not in the open market that you can keep on increasing rents. Some housing gets locked in that. So yes, the rents remain very low in many, many central areas, but then the owners have no incentive to improve. So we keep seeing the deterioration of housing quality inside the cities. And Urban Land Ceiling Act also is that you cannot really very easily sell and improve your housing. There's a ceiling on that. So then if we start summarizing what happens because of clearance and eviction related policies, which mostly got translated into formulating many cities and state governments explicitly talking about formulating policies about removing slums. So you see from both from 2-3 main cities, Chennai, Mumbai and Delhi, in mid-70s actually writing, you cannot have slums here. These kind of statements are written. And so government used these kind of statements actually to evict people, but there is no plan for resettlements. So what is the impact of this? New slums keep getting formed. You evict from one place. So in mid-70s, around 1977, we had a major eviction in Delhi. And within 2 years, you have formation of new slums all over. So then what is the impact of upgradation and redevelopment policies? This mostly got translated into slum renewable. Actually during this kind of policies, some of the cities started providing renewable lease to the land where the slums had been formed earlier. And they said that the cluster of slums, if they could come together, the lease could be given. So because there was one big issue initially that land does, people living in these low income housing don't have any ownership of land. And if you don't have ownership of land, many of them, even after having decent incomes, are not willing to invest in improving the housing stock. So to take care of this, then some kind of ownership was enabled. And because of this, at least, then to the slum cooperatives, basic amenities were provided, and also loan of at the rate of 12% was also made available. However, the weakness of this policy was that slums which had come up on central government land and on private land were not eligible for this. So it had only limited scope. And then over the years, what started happening, that when government roles became, instead of provider, more enabler, and very focused attempts to attract private sector in this, slowly commercial interest of attracting private sector overrides all the other interests. So we FSI is increased to attract private sector, and they are given in order to make it more attractive for them, they could actually sell and many of the apartments that they were building. Commercial uses were allowed. So of course in Mumbai, and mostly in Mumbai actually, these kind of developments have had massive opposition from the people who had got together. They had formed slum associations, and many of them went to the court also, actually questioning all this. So there's been a major litigation, and many plans remain on the drawing board, and it has not really translated into any meaningful slum redevelopment. So in the most recent initiatives, now in last 5 to 10 years, what has happened is that the previous government, not the current government, came up with this, what they call Rajiv Awas Yojana, which is they actually provided, the emphasis was on in situ development and providing loans, and actually also the interesting thing about this, so Rajiv Awas Yojana means it's a housing scheme, and they decided to just give a basic shell from the government, and then it was left to the owners to improve upon it. So it has had mixed experience so far. Few million houses did get constructed at this time. The quality, many people have questioned in the audits what quality of housing got constructed, but better than the slums, and they had some landowning rights also. So that is what continued up to 2014, and this was part of our, actually central government had come up with what they called Urban Renewal Mission. So at that time it was called Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, and this was part of that. But with the new government in 2014, those things have to be completely, the government decided to completely change everything. And now after 2 years, so first thing they announced in 2014 was, after 2-3 months of being in power, that we would focus on developing smart cities. And then of course there was a lot of discussion on what is smart city. Which continues up to today, but finally in last 6 months they started having some kind of competition. Cities had to bid for whether they were eligible for having access to funding available through smart city program. And just recently now 20 cities have been selected in the first round as being, proposals are according to whatever smart city is. But when I look at those Smart City 20 proposal, I find very interesting that actually there is hardly any discussion of slums now. The whole Smart City program is all about, how, of course they say, all the right words are there. It's equitable, it's sustainable, it is clean, green mobility, everything. Making smart use of data, smart use of many things. But now we have to see what happens, because I don't see any explicit discussion on what happens to employment, housing, access to basic amenities to poor people living in our cities, which I showed you in the beginning, is a substantial proportion. It is not a small proportion. So in next few slides now I will try and summarize what are the impacts that we have been documenting in terms of travel patterns and employment. So first thing, of course, we find that, what I call informal settlements, self-organized settlements, they're very, if you actually walk around in those settlements, they have pedestrian streets completely, because obviously that is what makes sense there. Vehicle ownership is very low. So it's not that the streets don't exist, they are very walking streets. They could be, and whereas in the planned places where we keep making, even the planned settlements for low income people by formal planners, we keep making streets for motorized traffic, yeah. I think that's what our training is now. So we cannot imagine a street which is less than 6 meter or 10 meter wide. And it's this one interesting data that we found was in the settlements, in these very self-organized settlements, 50% of the residents know 25% of the people living in their settlements. But in many of the formal plans, we don't find this data. How well do you know your neighbor? So now this is an interesting study that I have been, about this I have written many times. This was done by one of our PhD students in early 2000. In that we looked at people who were shifted because the metro was getting constructed in Delhi. In 2002, the first phase of metro was commissioned, and many households were moved out, obviously slum households, to make space for metro. So we did a very detailed study of this 4 groups of people. Poor people who continued to live next to metro line, and poor people who had moved out because of construction of metro line. What happens to them before relocation? What were the commuting patterns and employment patterns before relocation and after relocation? So first thing we found is that daily travel expenditure per person increases after relocation, and also in terms of time also, travel time also increases, and same thing you find for distance also. Then the other thing that was looked at, what about accessibility to public transport? So we found that earlier in the when they were in the self-organized locations also, distance to main road was less than half a kilometer, and this distance to main road in the newly planned settlements actually increased by more than 2 kilometers. And similarly, distance to bus stop earlier was just 200 meters, and after relocation it became more than 1 kilometer. So this is only in terms of distance, but when you see in terms of access to what kind of bus services, so clearly in the distant locations where people had been moved out, frequency of buses were very, very low, which continues up to today. Yes, there is a bus service, but maybe few services in the morning and few in the evening. So this then we looked at, this is now overall for Delhi. Who are the people actually traveling by different modes? And the 3 colors are showing you different income groups. Red is the lowest, less than 10,000 rupees per month income group. So when you look at people walking and people using public transport, it is clearly the low income people. And who's using cars? Obviously low income people are not there at all. Two-wheelers and buses are also being used slightly less by higher income people. So clearly low income people basically are pedestrians, bicycles and bus transport, not metro transport. Maybe metro also I shouldn't. I'm just trying to read if metro is written. Yeah, there is metro here. This metro is here. You see very few first of all, very few trips on metro, and obviously low income people are even less. And today we do have 200 kilometers of metro system in Delhi, but the distribution is similar. It is mostly being used by middle income and higher income people. So there is access, the metro lines do exist not very far from where poor people are living, but they cannot afford to use it. Then of course we see there is a nature of employment in these poor settlements. I think this is quite important to understand. Only 24% is formal employment and majority is informal employment. Within urban poor also there is a difference between how unemployed people are commuting and how employed poor people are commuting. As expected, unemployed people are walking more as compared to employed poor people. And so one of the things we did was we started understanding that using our formal conventional definitions of trip, we are not able to understand what is happening with low income people. So we tried to use activity and tour definition. And in tour definition we came up with, so you start from home and whole day you have spent doing various things and come back home in the evening. And then we defined what was the prime objective of that tour. Was it work related? Was it education related? Was it... So there is trip chaining, but we've tried to define it using what is the prime cause of doing it. So there we find that there is work, so WT means work related tour. So 91% are work related tour, and then few are school and non-work related tour in these. Now in this, now we find average distance to public, how much distance which has been traveled by public transport in terms of distance, time and travel cost. So now you see the difference between formal, informal, and student is younger population. So people who are employed in informal, they are traveling shorter distances, and that gets, you can see in terms of time also and in terms of money also. So it's only the formal people who are employed in formal sector, they are traveling slightly longer. And I already showed you that majority are actually informal employment in these settlements. Then what are the percentage of employees by tour distances? So again we find that very short tour distances, if you see, 0.4 to 2 kilometers, 2 to 5 kilometers, this is what your majority is. And here again you find that informal, actually same trend you observe here also. Informal people employed in informal sector are traveling shorter tours as compared to formal. So so I think it's useful to, all these years of working in this sector, trying to understand mobility patterns of poor and relating it with housing, one thing that started striking us about almost 10 years back, that when you talk to people living in this, in some of the impacts assessment we were doing, in several meetings it was actually pointed out by people living in these settlements, government is giving us 12 square meters or 15 square meters of space with a little bit of money, but which is about 15 to 20 kilometers away from our current location. And they said that we would like to invite these policy makers to our village. We can give them a bigger piece of land free of cost. We have not come to the city to have access to 25 square meters of space. The reason we move to cities is access to employment. And once you delink that, it is useless. But somehow it still hasn't, I think in our formal conventional methods, we still haven't, I would say we haven't included this at all. We have not been able to internalize this in our methods. So what we find in characteristic of informal settlements, self-organized, organic growth outside the formal process, they do lack formal services, they have poor quality housing, but at the same time, there is much to learn from density, diversity and the human scale of development that happens there. And I think why I have pointed this location, access to employment. And this employment is a very broad term here, access to both formal and informal employment is actually the most driving factor that we can find so far. And in terms of diversity also, I think that is very interesting, in some very different ways gets related to your discussion, that diversity here means diverse skills and diverse employment. So when these settlements are close to formal employment, formal planned settlements, this diversity exists there. Very low skill person, almost having no education, can also find some employment there. And then, of course, high skilled people can commute and they have no problem of finding employment. So in one of the studies, these authors have actually found very interesting statistics, again done some detailed work in Delhi. So what happens, so we had another round of major eviction in Delhi at the time of Commonwealth Games 2010. And at that time when the study was done, we found that the space which was reclaimed through eviction, what happens to that space? 24% remains vacant, 19% has been given to roads or creating parking for cars, or something related with roads. 14% some kind of parks and playgrounds have been created, 9% government infrastructure has come up, and 7% new slums have come up. So it is actually questioning that we actually haven't really understood what to do with also the reclaimed area. It could have been easily possible there to upgrade housing for low income groups where they had much better access to employment. But our commercial interests don't let us do that. So I think eventually I just question, that we have to understood this whole current discussion on whether you call it transit oriented development or mixed land use patterns. This whole discussion on density, which is basically high rise versus small. There is no dearth of density in many of these cities. Densities are extremely high. The question is, it is this low rise density versus high rise densities. And when we talk about monocentric or polycentric street patterns, many of these cities are polycentric by nature because the streets have a lot of informal employment. That itself is giving you, your street vendors, which in many other discussions you find eyes on the street. They make it secure actually, the streets. And this is one thing which I haven't mentioned in this paper is a crime rate in many Asian cities tend to be very low. There may be organized crime in Mumbai, but not so much street crime because there is so much presence of people on the road. And then diversity, when we talk about its mixed land use, and we have to understand mixed land use in a very different way, and presence of informal markets, and local designs which not about short car trips but about walking and bicycling trips. So I end with just 2-3 some key questions that can subsidized transport improve accessibility? And in most of our cities, the cities that I talk about, both Chennai, Mumbai and Delhi, public buses are subsidized and metro is also not charging the real cost of running metro. But as we find that both bus is slightly more accessible or used by low income people, but metro absolutely not. So, and then I think the bigger question is, it is not just when we started understanding the activity patterns of low income groups, it is not about simply economic unaffordability. It is also especially women wanting multitasking and flexibility in going back and forth from employment jobs to home to take care of household chores and that. So there is time poverty. So that cannot be solved simply by providing a subsidized public transport. And we find that destination, this is interesting actually when we looked at our tour analysis that we did for low income groups. So for people living in formal residential areas, they are going somewhere else for jobs, and people living in low income areas, they are coming there for their jobs. So this very formal definition of origin destination doesn't work here. It has to be understood very differently. And proximity to work is more important for women for multitasking. So this I already explained. I think this, in our policies, we really have to understand the link between livelihood, housing and mobility. it is not just about housing. It's not about affording a better quality of life through better housing and amenities. And what many of these settlements are showing, multiple use of space, the diversity and the intensity by which the space gets used here. The same area is completely used for production activities during the day, and at night it becomes, your house consumption activity. And also about how community living and how public spaces are being used by these communities. I think these three, we will need to have much more better understanding about these three than just talk about transport and land use. I think this is the last one, yeah.
Thank you very much.